Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael. I'll be your host for today in this webinar. I'm a cloud solutions architect from Massdriver. Massdriver is a visual internal developer platform that enables engineers and developers to deploy production-ready infrastructure and applications in minutes. Today, we'll be building an Azure OpenAI infrastructure bundle with features such as monitoring and secrets management. We'll then connect our OpenAI infrastructure bundle to our application that will use its API. If you'd like to follow along with me, I'll go ahead and paste a link to the GitHub repo where my project files are located into the chat here so you guys have it. So in this repo, the infrastructure bundle and the application bundle are already generated for you, but you still need to make some small modifications. An important note, if you're following along, Azure does require you to apply for access to Azure OpenAI in order to use the service. If you haven't done so already, you may not be able to follow along with every step, but I'd encourage you to get as far as you can. During the webinar, our COO and co-founder, Chris Hill from Massdriver will be in the chat, as well as some of members from my team, and they'll be in the Q&A rooms as well, answering any and all questions. So for this webinar, we're going to cover the following topics. We're going to create an Azure OpenAI infrastructure bundle. We're going to add monitoring to the OpenAI bundle. We're then going to create a Kubernetes deployment application. We're going to add some environment variables to that application and then publish it to our Massdriver UI. We'll then connect our application to OpenAI and deploy it. And then lastly, we'll access the Jupyter Notebook remotely that's going to be running in our application. Before we get started, let's briefly talk about some of the terminology that we'll be using during the webinar. We want to make sure that everyone's on the same page here. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is a bundle. Bundles are a package of Terraform, YAML, JSON, and other supporting files that make it possible to deploy and manage cloud infrastructure using our platform. Bundles should be narrowly scoped to reduce the complexity. And then we'll also be talking and mentioning the term artifact. So artifacts create connection rules for the bundles. They explicitly say what can and cannot be connected together. If my application expects a Postgres database, for example, I don't want my team to accidentally attach a MySQL database instead and break the application. All right, so without further ado, let's set up our OpenAI bundle. We're going to switch into the Massdriver canvas here, where I have an Azure Virtual Network deployed already. So to keep this webinar under an hour, we're going to start by deploying some infrastructure that our application will depend on. My application will run on Kubernetes. So what I want to do is search for AKS, and then we'll drag it out onto the canvas. Click Submit. As you can see, when I drag a bundle out into the canvas, it'll use this feature called the infrastructure generator that we have at Massdriver, which dynamically generates the dependencies of my bundle if they didn't exist, based on what the connection specifies. In this case, my AKS cluster needed an Azure Virtual Network to deploy. Like I mentioned, one was already there, but it made the connection for me. If my virtual network was not there on the canvas already, it would add one for me. I'll go ahead and configure my Kubernetes cluster. We're just going to select some development presets. We're going to enable an ingress controller, and we're going to add a DNS zone so I can access my notebook and click deploy. So we're going to let this run in the background. And then while that's running, we're going to go ahead and create our OpenAI infrastructure bundle. So let's switch to VS Code here. Just briefly, I have a basic notebook typed up here. This is essentially mostly from Microsoft documentation. This is a full notebook for running a fine-tuning job. I also have a Docker file, which will create an image of my notebook, install the dependencies, and then run the image in the container. And then I just have a simple requirements file to install my dependencies. Okay, so what we need to do now is run a command mass bundle new. So mass bundle new is going to generate some application templates for me. And I want to name my bundle Azure OpenAI, since this is an infrastructure bundle. And then we'll call this my Azure OpenAI service. And then let me make this a little bit bigger here. And then we're going to select the Terraform module template. So for my Azure OpenAI service, I'm making a custom bundle. I do know that since this service is deploying into my Azure account, I need my bundle to be able to use the Azure Service Principal connection. So I'm going to search for Service Principal, and then there we have Service Principal. So I'm going to enable it. We can see that it's enabled down here, and then click Enter. We'll call this Azure Service Principal. And then we'll output this into an infra directory. So cd into infra. And then I'll just minimize this a little bit. We have this new directory. We have in the source directory some Terraform files and also the other supporting files that make up a bundle. So now that my template is generated, I'm going to copy over some of these Terraform files and the YAML file over from the GitHub repo. I'm going to repaste the link to the GitHub repo in the chat in case anybody's missed it. And then we'll go ahead and switch pages here. So here's a repo for the webinar. I have my infra directory, and then I need to copy some Terraform. So I'm just going to do some copying, and then I'll explain what I'm adding here. So in the main.tf file, all we're doing is we're creating an Azure resource group, and then we're creating an Azure Cognitive account, specifically the OpenAI variant, and then we're setting a SKU. And then I need some more files here. We're going to go into providers. We'll copy the providers. If anybody's unfamiliar with Terraform, what the providers file does is essentially sets the Terraform provider that my Terraform code is going to be using. And then connecting to that Terraform provider, I'm setting the credentials for the service principal that will allow me to deploy the Terraform resources into my cloud account. And then we need a monitoring file. So I'll go through this. Once I create this new file, we'll call this monitoring.tf. So briefly, we're setting some locals for some automated configurations. We are adding a module. This is a Massdriver alarm channel module that will send the status of metrics to Massdriver. And then we're also creating a metric alert in Azure, which defines what kind of alerts that we want to track, and then what parameters we want to set when that alert is triggered. So that gets set here. And then we need to copy over the YAML file. So I'll cover this YAML file as well briefly. The Massdriver YAML file, if you're not familiar with it, this is the file that manages the configuration page in Massdriver. When you click configure on a bundle and you see options there for what you can pick and choose before you deploy your bundle, this Massdriver.yaml is what manages that. So we do have some configurations for the alarm, just some basic settings if we were to customize what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and minimize it. We also have some parameters to choose a region. And then we have some more monitoring parameters, whether we wanted automated with those hard-coded locals, custom, and then disabled. We have our connections block here. We stated that we wanted to connect with an Azure Service Principal. This is what allows us to deploy our custom OpenAI bundle into Azure. We have an artifacts block, which acts as the outputs. Remember that the artifact sets the rules for connections from a bundle to bundle. And we're essentially stating that this is what this output is called. And then we're ordering our UI with the UI block here. Okay, so now that my files are copied over, I need to publish my bundle to Massdriver. So we're going to run mass bundle publish. And this is going to publish and generate additional files. We'll switch back over to Massdriver. Kubernetes is still deploying. We'll run a refresh here. And then we'll type in OpenAI. So we have OpenAI. We'll call this OpenAI and click submit. And then now we have our custom Azure OpenAI bundle. I'm going to click configure and we're going to select a region. I'll select North Central US and click deploy. So now that's running in the background. Let's switch back to VS Code and generate our application. So let me expand this terminal a little bit. We'll go back into the root webinar directory and we're going to run mass bundle new again. Mass bundle new. This time we're going to name our template again. So this one is going to be fine tuning. And then we'll set the description to my OpenAI fine tuning app. We then want to select Kubernetes deployment. Since our application is going to be running on Kubernetes, this is the template that we want to select. So for the dependency, what we're going to do for now is select none. I'm going to show you guys how to add an API connection dependency here in a little bit. But for now, we're just going to select none. And then we're going to set our output directory to app. So now I'm just going to close all these files here. We have our app directory. We have the Terraform file that creates our application template. We have an artifact file, which we're not using, and we're not going to need to use that. But we also have the massdriver.yaml file. So the massdriver.yaml file, again, is what controls the configuration page in Massdriver when you click configure on a bundle. We do need to make a couple changes to this file for our application so that we can add some environment variables. Our environment variables are going to be passed down to us from our custom OpenAI bundle. First, before we can set those environment variables, we need to create the connection that I mentioned. So in this connections block, this is where we're going to set this custom connection. We're going to add a new line here and call it endpoint. And then we're going to ref, not quite Massdriver endpoint, nice try Copilot. We're going to call this Massdriver/API. So what this is going to do is this is going to use Massdriver's official API artifact definition. And then we're going to also make it required. So we're going to add endpoint to the required block. Now we can go ahead and set our environment variables. So we're going to erase the curly braces and add a new line. So the only thing that we need to do now is set our environment variables. We have the connection in place. We're going to add two keys. The first key that we need to add, we can actually see in our notebook. We need to add OpenAI API key. And then we'll pull in. And then we need to add OpenAI API endpoint. So these are the environment variables that I set in my application. So the API endpoint, I need to set the value of the key to the artifact data that is being injected into my app runtime from my OpenAI service. I could manually hard code it, but I'd rather set it dynamically so that if the value changes, my app doesn't break. To set the value dynamically, we use jQuery. jQuery allows us to reference the JSON object structure that's being passed down from the artifact and extract the value. It's going to look something like this. We're going to do .connections, .endpoint, .data, .api, .hostname. So I need to get the hostname from my OpenAI service. If we look at my connections block, we're just going to scroll back down here. We have this connections block. And within connections block, we have endpoint. So this is how I'm building out my jQuery string. We're going to scroll all the way back up. My connections jQuery string starts with .connections.endpoint. Okay, I then need to get the hostname value from that. I didn't pull this string out of thin air. Let's look briefly at why it's structured this way and how we got to data API hostname. To do so, I'm going to open up the GitHub repo for the artifact definition for the API, which is public. I'm going to switch pages here. And we're going to go into the API artifact definition. I also posted that link in the chat if anybody would like to check it out. In this GitHub repo, we have an artifact definition created for an API schema. Setting aside all of these properties blocks, we're going to drill down to the hostname field. So we're going to have data, and then we're going to go down into API, and then within API, we have hostname. And that's how we extract the hostname. If we look back at our jQuery string, we start with .connections, again, which references the connection block in our YAML file, and then endpoint, which narrows down the connection that we're referring to. We then finish the string with the schema route to the hostname, and that's it. For the API key, we're going to do almost the exact same thing, except we're going to change it up a little bit. The API key is going to be a little bit tricky. Since the artifact definition doesn't have a field for API key, I'll just show here. We have hostname, port, protocol. We also have etc. We don't have API key. Because the API key doesn't exist, we need to create it. Oops, I meant to stay on the artifact page. Sorry about the frequent switching there. So what we do have is this etc block. This etc block allows for additional properties. This is important because this means that we can create additional fields and then reference values in those fields. So first, let's set the environment variable. We're going to switch back to VS Code. We're going to set the environment variable to .connections, .endpoint, .data, .etc, .api key. So we set this value here. We then want to go into our infra directory. I'm going to show you why it's set to this specifically, API key. In the infra directory, in the source directory of infra, we have the artifacts file. Let's go ahead and copy the artifacts file from the repo. So this is a file that we did miss, or I missed to copy over. So I'll go ahead and copy over this file, and then we'll go through it. So this is an artifact file for my bundle. What this does is it creates a resource, which is a Massdriver artifact, and it'll output these values in that artifact. We see that we have API, and then the host name and the port. This is referencing the endpoint for the Azure OpenAI. We also have the API key set here. This etc block allows me to create these additional properties, so I can create random values as I need to, such as API key, and then reference the Terraform value that comes out of the deployment, which will be the value that will be added in there. Since I did update this file, I do need to republish my my bundle here. So we're going to cd into infra and run mass bundle publish again. And then we can go into Massdriver, refresh. As you can see, we have an update for OpenAI bundle. So we'll go ahead and deploy that update. Okay, so I've created the new key. I've added the etc block, and then I've set the environment variable. This gives me, or rather my app, the API key of Azure OpenAI. Awesome. So now that we have our environment variable set, we can publish our application to Massdriver. So we are going to, let me clear this for you. We're going to cd into app, and then we're going to run mass bundle publish. Great. So now that our application is published, we want to create a Docker image for our application, for our notebook. So again, we do have this Docker file here. It's a very simple Docker file. And we're going to use our mass CLI tool to run a cool command called mass image push. So mass image push will do a few things. First, it's going to run Docker build to build your image. It'll then use your Massdriver cloud credentials to query your cloud account and create a cloud container registry tagged with Massdriver. If you've used this command more than once, it'll look for your existing cloud container registry and use it if you're specifying the same region as before. Then it'll use the CLI to push your Docker image to the cloud container registry and then output the URL for your container repo. Let's get started. I'm just going to copy a single command here and paste it in, and then we'll run through what this command does. So at mass image push, this first part here, like I mentioned before, it does the image building and pushing to the cloud container registry. We then set a namespace of Massdriver and then the image name to OpenAI. You can think of this as a directory with an image name. And this structure is required, the namespace / image. We also set the region to East US. And then we set the next argument, which is -A, is our artifact ID. Now, we will need to add our artifact ID by going into Massdriver. I'm just going to show you how that looks real quick. We'll go ahead and switch into Massdriver. We're going to click on artifacts here on the left. And then we have our Azure Service Principal artifact. We'll go ahead and open that up. And then we can click copy artifact ID. And then the last argument is -T for tag. I've set it to latest. This is an optional argument. If you omit it, it will use latest by default. Okay, so let's go ahead and enter and let this push up. Actually, this is going to error out because I'm not where my Docker container is, or my Docker image is. All right, now we're going to go ahead and run it. So this will take a couple minutes to push up. While we're waiting, I did want to mention that we are hosting more webinars. Next week, our COO, Chris Hill, will host a webinar about how to debug applications running on Kubernetes. And on the horizon, our CEO, Corey O'Daniel, will host a webinar on containerizing a web application without Docker. Okay, and there we go. We have the image pushed up to our Azure Container Registry, and it gave us the link to reference the image. We're going to copy the value here, and then we're going to switch to the Massdriver UI. I'm going to go back into our projects, into OpenAI, staging environment. We can then look for our fine-tuning app, and here it is. So we'll call this fine-tuning. And then again, our infrastructure generator is going to connect everything for us. So we have OpenAI deployed. We have Kubernetes deployed. All that's left is our application. So we'll click configure and then paste the image into the repository field. We can erase the suffix here with the tag, since the tag is set in the next field. You can scroll down a bit. We need to add some resources. So this is going to be a pretty small notebook, not very large. I'm going to add 1 core and 1 megabyte of memory. We're going to set our port to 8888. And then we're going to enable public internet access. We'll call this data.nd@azuresvx.com. And let me confirm the port here real quick. I'm going to do that by switching over to VS Code briefly. Yep, I'm exposing port 8888. So that's what I want to use. And then we'll click deploy. Perfect. So this does also take a couple minutes to deploy. While we're waiting, I did want to mention that we do have a community Slack for Massdriver. I'll go ahead and post that link into the chat. The community Slack is available for anyone to join, customer or not. We are aiming to build a community of engineers, developers, and enthusiasts who maybe want to know more about Massdriver or are already using Massdriver and might need some help. Members of Massdriver are in the Slack as well, so feel free to pop in and say hi. We will also be at AWS reInvent this year in Las Vegas. We do have a booth. If you are attending AWS reInvent, please stop by and see us. We're giving away some sweet swag. We're going to have a demo there. All of our founders will be there. I will be there. I will be happy to meet you if you're going to AWS reInvent. Okay, so it's just going to take another minute to deploy. I'm going to wait on that real quick. So I did want to show one thing real quick. We are going to be connecting to this Kubernetes cluster to get our Jupyter Notebook token. And I can show you what that looks like right now. So on our Kubernetes cluster here, we do have this artifact box. So this artifact box, again, is what passes down the information needed for my application to run on Kubernetes. It sets those rules for me. I do have the ability to download the kube config, which I'm going to do now. So I'm going to click on this More Options button on the right-hand side and select kube config. Oops, that disappeared there. I'm going to select kube config and then select kube config again to download it. And then I'm going to go ahead and rename my file here. I can show you my window. We're going to rename my file to webinar-OpenAI. And then we're going to cut it and add it to WSL. Perfect. Okay. So now that our kube config is in there and our application is still deploying, hit the progress button, still deploying, I'll go ahead and open up VS Code in the terminal. And we're going to export kube config equals kube and then webinar OpenAI. So if I do kubectl get pods, we'll see that our pod is up and running already. Perfect. We'll switch back to Massdriver, and we do see that the provisioning is complete. I'm going to click configure again on my application, and we're just going to copy the URL here and open it up in a new tab. Okay, so it's loading Jupyter, but because of security configurations, we need to add the token. So this is where exporting the kube config comes in. I'm going to switch back to VS Code here for a second. We do have our pod up and running. What we want to do now is fetch our Jupyter token. We can do that with this command. We do kubectl exec-it. We're going to copy the name of the pod -- Jupyter notebook list. And that is going to give us the token. So everything after the token equals is our token. We're going to copy that value. And then I'll paste it in to set up a password. I'll set up a password here and click enter. And there we are. We have our Jupyter notebook up and running. We can open up our notebook here so that we can run some fine tuning as needed. I would run the fine tuning, but we do have an issue with cognitive service at the moment. I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced this. The cognitive service in OpenAI, since an update, I think released yesterday, they're essentially not allowing their API to run. I can actually show you what that looks like if anybody's interested in what the error might look like. So we're going to run this first page, and then we're just going to get a generic 500 error, which Azure support is aware of. But we did paste in the token. Oops. Sorry about that. And here's the error message that popped up, very generic. But that's it. So that's essentially what we were able to do. We made it as far as we could before Azure OpenAI services really limited our progress. And that's all we were able to do. So to recap, what we just did is we created a custom Azure OpenAI bundle. We then created a Kubernetes application and connected our Kubernetes app to Azure OpenAI. We then built and pushed our Jupyter Notebook Docker image to the Azure Container Registry, and then accessed our notebook remotely. I also wanted to mention that we deployed infrastructure and an application in Azure, meeting best practices, security compliances, network isolation, all of those standards in 30 minutes. That's just food for thought. Okay, this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will be sticking around to answer some questions. If you are interested in learning more about Massdriver, please feel free to reach out to me, michael@massdriver.cloud. You can schedule a demo at massdriver.cloud/contact. You can also find out more about Massdriver simply at massdriver.cloud. Thank you.